a live virtual event without some technical difficulties. So apologize for being a few minutes late. Hopefully gave you guys a chance to catch up on Slack and email, because knowing we just don't have enough time for that during our day. So welcome to our weekly What the F is RevOps. So excited to be here today. Got a great guest, Brantley Pace, who's joining us from Hopin. Brantley, introduction, background, anything you want to let us know before we kick off today?
Yeah, thanks so much. Really excited to be here. I've been a member of Rev Genius for a really long time and have really benefited from attending these and being a part of the different workshops and mentor and mentee sessions and the Slack community. So just really stoked to be part of this and be part of this conversation, because I think the question is one that's and asked a lot, and the answer can oftentimes vary between company to company, and certainly is in the industry, it's a very exciting place to be when you get to ask questions that are not clearly defined. So I'm Brantley. I'm head of revenue operations, or RevOps, at Hopin. Hopin is a virtual events company that also has a few other subsidiary companies like StreamYard, Session, Streamable, and a few others. And so get the benefit of working not just with Hopin proper, but with a lot of other companies, and how we cross-sell and bundle and basically run the revenue systems. And so I joined a few years ago and helped be a part of a lot of different series, rounds, raises and scalings and M&As, and a lot of the things that from a RevOps perspective can be a lot of fun. For some people, it may be anxiety inducing, but from a RevOps perspective, it's certainly exciting last few years, and excited to talk about it.
I was going to say, I have to imagine with the world of, global pandemic and kind of that industry, you guys probably saw some really interesting stuff the last few years as we moved to more virtual events and some growth there.
That's right. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. One of the things that I love to ask kind of at the beginning point to give some context is tell us about your team, right? So one thing you mentioned is revenue operations is different at every company. So I would love to learn more about how it's structured at Hopin, where you guys sit within the organization, what your team dynamic looks like.
That's a great question. I think, RevOps for a lot of companies evolved out of, sales ops, marketing ops, or CX ops. And so the way that materialized for us is certainly follow that trajectory. And so originally we were basically just general ops, biz ops, and as we specialized into sales ops, into CX ops, into marketing ops. But as RevOps became much more popular in the industry, there's a lot of value in assigning an operations team to the revenue process and not just to the verticals. And so that's where our RevOps team is today. Is we've gone through all of those. We've gone from generalists to specialists to revenue aligned. And so our RevOps team today focuses on marketing ops, sales ops, CX ops, and we work with a lot of the behind the scenes ops teams like finance and accounting, which have their own ops teams really focused on the actual invoicing and the billing. And we do have a few marketing ops specialists that for particular product lines that really need, that type of structure works well. But our team is basically go-to-market aligned, or GTM aligned. And so we're aligned with the GTM team that has a revenue target. And so when we think about RevOps, it's not just analytics, it's not just IT, it's not just systems. It really is supporting the actual revenue target and all the things that drives that revenue number. And so that's where Hopin is. We've got RevOps analysts, RevOps managers. We have a Salesforce team. So we keep that within RevOps itself. That's not part of IT, which it may be at some other companies. And that's basically how our team is structured today.
I love that. I love that we're tied to go-to-market, right? It's truly go-to-market operations and following, again, the revenue process, the customer experience, not just the single, this is our revenue operations team, but it's truly sales ops or, kind of that piece. So really thank you for sharing that philosophy. Where, the hot topic in the room is where does RevOps report, right? So who do you report to? What line do you report into?
We have reported to a lot of different people over time. And I would say that it oftentimes has really a lot to do with the size of your company. Because sometimes I hear people say, well, you should report to this and that. I'm like, well, sure, if your company has all those roles, right? But I think RevOps, at least from my perspective, has always been through the lens of startups. And startups are very rarely static. It's feast or famine. You're either growing like crazy or you're reorganizing or shifting here, or there's pivots. Like I've had the good fortune of being involved in each of those stages. I've been a part of my own startup, which is we went through an accelerator called Techstars. It was 5 people, and RevOps is basically everybody's role. Everybody was doing some type of operations role, and then you do seed and the Series A, and then B and C, and each of those expands beyond that. So who RevOps reports to has a lot to do with this, the stage you're at, what you're focused on. Are you a sales-led growth company, or a PLG, or a combination of both? Are you in the middle of shifting between that? And so today we report to a strategy and ops team. And so we've got a biz ops team, which is focused on long-term strategic initiatives. So what product are we launching 6 months from now? What does pricing look like over 6 to the next 12 months? And RevOps is much more focused on the revenue target, which is the revenue team, and sales teams often focus much more on monthly, quarterly, and H2 goals. And so we've just found that to be a pretty good balance. But I do believe that there's strong value in having ops not report to sales or report directly to a go-to-market lead. It's not always, and not, of course, not the end of the world for that, but there's a value to having separation of church and state, meaning that if operations and RevOps is helping drive those goals, what I've seen is if sales ops reports to sales or marketing ops reports to marketing, they oftentimes drive exclusively that person's ownership, but RevOps has the value of seeing the entire picture. And by working with the team that's not directly owning a single number, they can help kind of call balls from strikes. They can help be the neutral decision maker.
You get a different perspective, right? So like one of the big things that I've seen from, back to your point, RevOps, we're working so cross-functionally, we're able to actually, have more of that holistic view of the process, of the cycle. And, generally most of us are really wired into a continuous improvement mindset and always looking for opportunity. And so by having, that perspective, and then also, having the authority and the autonomy to give those recommendations and feel like you can focus on those improvements, I think is really, really empowering, especially as we talk about, revenue operations growing into, more of strategic function versus tactical function. As this continues to evolve as well.
Okay.
So, I'm going to kind of throw some questions out at you. And again, members on the live stream, feel free to drop questions in the chat. We'll happily answer. But what's a common misconception like you think people have about revenue operations that you'd love to clear up?
I think a lot of people's concept of RevOps is generally through the lens in which they work with them. And so even internally, teams I've worked with for a really long time, they don't know fully what we do, right? They know what we do in context of how we support their direct team, right? But I think the biggest misconception is people don't know, what the fuck RevOps is. They're like, I know that you help me with, for instance, we also do deal desk, right? And so well, I know you help me with the deal, and sometimes we might be the approval or the rejecter on certain deals, or maybe from top of the funnel, we're the person that helps route their leads or gets, lead assignment, or an invoice, finance and accounting or legal. We're supporting on order management. We're supporting on making sure that when we're a UK based company, and so that if we go through audits and those types of things, that our records are clean and we're meeting the standards of a business that we should be operating at. And so I would say the biggest misconception of RevOps is what do they actually do beyond the lens of which I work with them on. And so I'm hopeful that throughout this conversation that people who don't know anything get some context, and those that know a little bit based on their experiences, they understand a little bit more about what RevOps does. And then for people who have an interest in it career-wise, in my mind, there's a really exciting component of it, because I think the misconception that RevOps is IT or systems or analytics is missing functionally what RevOps for me is different than other ops, which is I think of RevOps as growth hacking within a company, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's strategic, advisory within your organization, right? So it's because we understand the business and helping develop the business, we're continuing to evolve and help the business grow, hit those targets, build that out, not just, the person who reassigns your accounts in Salesforce. While we do that too, and that is still important, there's other components to that. If you think about, I think, based on kind of our conversation, you came up through more of a traditional sales background. Is that correct? And then kind of made a move into here. So what would be kind of some of the advice you'd give to somebody who's looking to either maybe start a career in RevOps, like early start a career, and then somebody who maybe is looking to make a transition into operations from more of like a functional role, whether that's, sales or marketing or CS?
Yeah, I mean, when I was first exposed to sales ops as a sales rep, I thought it was terrible. I thought, I was like, I literally couldn't, I was like, why would somebody want to do that? That sounds absolutely, and at that point in my career, like that would have been true. Like I saw them doing like Salesforce reports, and I was like, I was like, more power to them. If that's what people want to do. And I enjoy being in sales. I like being an account executive. I like being a team lead. I just love, like, there was quite literally just nothing, and still to this day, it's exciting as closing deals. Like there's something really fun about that. But what ended up doing is I spent a really long time in sales, and a lot of different types of sales: SaaS sales, regular sales. Regular sales meaning like things outside of tech. And I ended up starting my own startup. And I think a lot of founders, in order to build a company, you have to do a lot of the operations. You learn how everything works together. And that exposed me to a lot of ways you can drive impact beyond an individual quota. And so for me, getting into RevOps meant thinking outside of the nuts and bolts of operations, but really, like, I feel like I own a part of that revenue target. When we set a number, it's not my personal quota. I'm not actually signing the deal, but I really view myself, and by extension my team, as an ownership of those numbers. If we don't hit those numbers, what could we have done in RevOps to help influence that outcome, right? It's not just keeping the lights on, but really driving actual revenue impact and revenue growth. And so when people start thinking about RevOps, and particularly if they come from a sales side, there's opportunity to really drive impact. For instance, let's say you've got, base business AMR, so 10 million. If you can improve the efficiencies and outcome that by 10, 15%, you can drive $1 million, $1.5 million in actual tangible revenue, right? And as an individual sales rep, that's harder to do. And so you can drive revenue targets without being strictly in sales and owning an individual quota. And so that leap has helped me. Some people come from analytics and they find themselves in RevOps by virtue of just working on more data and helping drive strategic decisions. Some people come from actual IC roles like sales and marketing, find themselves being intrigued by how those systems work together. But ultimately, in my mind, they all converge into, do you want to drive the entire revenue process versus just one component of it?
Absolutely. One of the things I'd like to hone in on here is, as you think about kind of like the goals that you set for your team and looking at, the metrics for success and like the KPIs, how do you best measure those, right? Are you using, efficiency metrics? How are you tracking those? Because I know that that's been something that's come up a lot, is like, how do we measure the success of revenue operations?
It's a great question. And that's something that comes up, of course, every quarter as OKRs come out. And ideally, in best case scenario, OKRs start from the top, and then everybody aligns their team goals to those OKRs. And so that's how I try to approach it, which is revenue operations needs to be driving revenue. And what are the revenue targets? And that's how we prioritize. But there's a lot of keep the lights on things you have to do. You have to sign books of business. You have to approve things. You have to put friction where friction is needed and remove friction where it's not. And sometimes you can find yourself just being busy and not actually driving work. So you're saying, are you working hard? Yes. Are you busy? Yes. Are you driving impact? No. Right. And that third question there is driven off of, are you prioritizing things that drive revenue? And I'll give you an example. So part of the way that we think about the business is stages of that revenue cycle. So top of the funnel. How do you know if you're doing the right things in revenue for the top of the funnel? And so what is your time to touch? Are you measuring that? How long does it take to go from interest, to meeting with sales? Or is it the most efficient way possible? Where are the inefficiencies? And what are you doing to drive down time to touch? That's been a big focus for us. For those focused at the top of the funnel, is our time to touch wasn't where it needed to be. It was, and then some things happened, and it wasn't. And then so we were, like, in all cases, adjusting to the context of the world around us. And so our priorities were around decreasing time to touch, and how do we implement a new process to drive, to make it faster and easier for the customer to talk to sales. Because ultimately, not only is it revenue focused, but it's got to be through the lens of the customer, right? The customer doesn't care about any of those things that happen in the back end. They've got a need and they want to talk to somebody as soon as possible about that need. And then your RevOps job is to make that world a reality, and so seamless they think nothing happens, right? But I'll give a plug for one of my favorite tools, Chili Piper, right? And so if somebody has an interest in a product and they got a need and they click talk to sales, traditionally there's a lot of companies, you get a thank you page, and 3 days from now some SDR emails you. Well,
hopefully, if you're lucky, right?
If you're lucky, but if you're really optimizing RevOps and you're thinking about how do you drive revenue faster, right? What happens for us in a lot of companies that are implementing these processes is, as soon as you hit contact sales form, in about a nanosecond, you're going to see the calendar pop up. And what's happening is you got a Marketo form that gets enriched by ZoomInfo or Clearbit, which then a record gets created in Salesforce, and then Chili Piper presents a queue. And you do that thousands of times, hopefully without error. And the customer experience is like, great, I got a need and I'm talking to somebody. But all those things have to work in tandem with multiple different teams, multiple different systems. And so that's how we prioritize our KPI, which is, if the goal is to generate revenue, well, we need to generate pipeline. And we know that what influences pipeline is time to touch. And so how do we prioritize our weekly sprints to drive time to touch down? How do we either simplify that process or identify inefficiencies in the process and put in, revenue updates throughout that?
Awesome. And we've got some questions coming in, and I know the chat's disabled. So if you guys can use the Q&A feature, that will definitely help. But with respect to time to touch, who's responsible for that in your opinion? Is it marketing inbound? Is it BDR? Is it straight AE?
Yeah, that's such a great question, because we've had that as a very active question over time. In my mind, the person who owns that is responsible for the pipeline number, because time to touch is a component of total pipeline. So is there an SDR team, right? Is there somebody responsible for actually emailing that person? Are you measuring time to touch from interest to first email? Is it interest to a phone call? Is it interest to a meeting? Because those can actually be different, because there's times when I'm buying software, I'm not looking to talk to you in 5 minutes. I want to talk on Monday, and today's Thursday. And so I'm okay with meeting on Monday that meets my schedule. And so that's an acceptable time to meeting window, right? And we can do that through things like Chili Pipe, because we bypass the whole back and forth of emailing times. And so for me, the ownership of time to touch is the person who owns pipeline. Who's responsible for generating pipeline? Is it going from interest to account executive? Then the sales team owns it. If there's an SDR or business development team, then the business development team does, in support of RevOps. RevOps, needs to support that, but the actual person reaching out is generally a person, an SDR, BDR, or an account executive, and those respective teams should own it. I think marketing is tough to own that, because how can you own the result if you don't own the action?
Yep. I mean, and some of it's with the operations and the systems, right? The experience that marketing helps to create from the web component, but again, doesn't own the action, but can help drive a better experience.
That's right. Yeah.
No, that's great. And we had another Q&A come in. Have you heard of any successes in outsourcing or bringing in a contractor freelancer to handle revenue operations? I'm really interested in your feedback here.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we've worked a lot with contractors at varying stages. I think I'm less a fan of consultants than contractors. I think sometimes those can be used interchangeably, but the way that I see the difference between consultants and consultants get paid to kind of just talk, and contractors get paid to do. And so if you're just bringing a consultant, and there's a lot of great consultants out there, and there's times in your business where you need some really big consult. Like for instance, you're about to IPO, and it makes sense to bring in people who've done that, and that there's times where that really works. But I would say if you're looking to generate action, contractors are great. Contractors are great for 3 main reasons. One, they go in your books as a different spend than full-time headcount. You don't have to commit to that person or that role for years to come. And so you may not always need a long-term need. And so a short-term need, or at least potential short-term need, can be a great fit for a short-term resource. There's also there's such great talent out there that are 1099s, that are freelancers, that can come in and help out with an initial project. For instance, a CPQ implementation, you're not going to implement that forever. It's an implementation in a management phase. A CRM migration, you may work with the consultancy that brings in contractors. So we worked with Cloud Gaia, Atana, Coastal Cloud, all really great options for Salesforce that says, hey, do you need those long-term? Is it just a short-term need? And so like anything else, there's a large talent differential between good, bad, and ugly. And you have to be really specific on who you're looking for and what the expectations are. But we actively work with contractors today. We've worked a lot in the past, managed them directly. There are times it works great for them, and there are times when it doesn't. And as long as you understand the value of a full-time employee versus the contractor, I think who, as far as I'm concerned, who retains your taxes is a little consequence to what are they actually driving. And that's really where the difference between seeing a full-time employee and a contractor is, who do I need long-term to own something, and who can come in and really make impact today. Top Tile's a great example. They can come in, drive impact, but you don't have to commit to them for a year. They could just be a 90-day project.
And they don't have to fully understand the business, right? Because there's, a lot of value in, having somebody who understands the business to be able to make the decisions versus somebody who's executing on the business strategy that can pick up requirements, especially in, more of the technical piece with guidance, where you might not just have the capacity to be able
There's
to
also fractional options.
Yeah.
Do you need somebody 40 hours a week for the next 2 years? Well, that's what you're saying for a full-time employee, right? Maybe you need somebody for 10 or 20, and then you got fractional options. And I think a lot of people in RevOps are like, hey, we just need somebody to do this at this point in time for this many hours. You've got a great use case for either a RevOps specialist or somebody who oftentimes falls within RevOps, which could be a lead gen specialist. It could be somebody who knows a specific tool you're doing, like NetSuite or Marketo or something along those lines. Within each business, it makes total sense to use contractor appropriate. You pay a premium per hour, but your net cost will most likely be lower than a full-time employee.
We had another good question. So it's scenario based. You have a 100-person startup doing between 5 million and 15 million in ARR. Question: who do you hire first? A VP of revenue operations, strategic, and can hire a team, or a manager of revenue operations who's a hands-on builder?
At 100 people, I hope somebody's already doing operations at that level. Just because that's, I think the question is appropriately phrased, which is, do you need hands-on, you need strategic, which is basically the question is the answer, which is if you need strategic support and you're thinking about, are you expanding to EMEA and APAC, or you roll out multiple business lines, are you thinking about 6 months from now, do you need 50 to 60 new people, and capacity planning is much larger, then you probably need VP level talent. If you're thinking about our CRM's jacked up and everything's messed up and no one knows what's going on and time to touch, what does that mean? And everything's a mess, which can happen even in a 100-person startup in a blink of an eye, particularly if it was a 10-person startup 3 months ago, then you're going to want a manager who can come in and drive that. There are some VPs that can roll their sleeves up and they can dive in, but this is something that I think a lot of companies either have learned or will learn, which is you really need to distinguish between how much of an individual contributor that person needs. Because if somebody comes in as a VP and they don't have a team, and you go, great, we need to implement CPQ, and then their only solution is hiring 5 people, then what you've really done is your VP is an additional cost of 10 more people. Because in order for them to execute their strategy, they themselves either through time or just they basically lost the individual skill sets to roll up their sleeves and get it done. And that's something that within our team, I keep driving home is that it's not enough for RevOps to be strategy. We have to be all 3: people, platform, and process. You can't just think of a strategy and expect somebody else to do it. You got to roll up your sleeves, you got to get into the tools, and you got to implement the solutions ourselves. And it's at that component, you can really drive outcome. And so if it's a VP role and you don't have a manager or team left, you need somebody who's basically can be an IC 50% of the day. And some people want to do that. Or you need to budget in a team of 5 or 6 to 10 more, right? And if you don't have any, if you're not thinking about expansions and new products, then a manager is fine. But a 100-person company, you're probably going to need, let's assume 40% of that is go-to-market, 60% is engineers. If you got a 40-person sales team with no ops team yet, one person is going to be stretched. You're probably going to need 2, and you probably would need 3 if you're fully optimized.
And like your one person, if you find that one person has to be a unicorn to some extent, right? I mean, you think about a single ops person that is doing execution, and you're looking at across marketing, sales, CS ops, technology, analytics, you're expecting one person to do 5 different functional
That's right. Yeah.
domain roles, which, I don't know that that person exists. If they do, call me because I'd love to hire you. But
Yeah.
I don't think you see that very much. And like to your point of like, if you hire the VP role and you expect them to then be doing 40% tactical execution, there's no, I mean, I don't foresee somebody coming in at that level being able to be the only RevOps person doing 40% execution, right? They're going to be doing 80 to 90 to 100% execution, and then get lucky if they can pull their head out of the weeds to look at the strategy. So like, you want to be really purposeful, back to your point of like, what are you hiring this person to do? And like, what do you need from the business? Because like, if you are trying to grow, you're expanding markets, like you need that futuristic, you need to let that person do that work versus trying to set your CRM up at the same time. Like it doesn't work that way.
Yeah. I mean, if your VP of RevOps is managing hierarchies in Salesforce and they're running an Excel comp plan for 40 plus people, like a 100-person company, right? So you got 40 of that is sales. And then at what point are they supposed to zoom out and think about expansion markets in 6 months, right? On the flip side, if you hire a manager and they're just, top to bottom all day long, just putting out fires and cases and support and lead routing errors, and then you're going, hey, what's capacity plan look like for Germany and DACH in 6 months? They're going to go, I'm literally just trying to keep the lights on. Like both teams would be set up to failure. So one or the other has a lot to do with what's the needs of the company and what's the expectation of that person.
Yep. And I mean, I think like ideal case is you have both, right? It's a matter of like what you need today and like where you need to get today, but also being, mindful of the future. We had another question, like, how would you distinguish between a VP of revenue operations and a CRO?
I think that's a great question. When I think about C-suite versus a VP level, C-suite, every time you go up a level, you should be owning a bigger piece of the company strategy. And a chief revenue officer really should be owning the entire revenue number, right? I think there's maybe some distinguishing difference between a chief revenue officer, a chief business officer, potentially a CEO, but that person owns the final revenue target, the final revenue number, right? And so I would anticipate a chief revenue officer also having a sales team, but it's possible a chief revenue officer isn't, and they're just focused more on the operations, and there's like a chief business officer component, but ultimately they're owning the final revenue number, which involves everything, the customer success strategy. They're looking at capacity planning, they're thinking about account management, they're thinking about AEs, they're thinking about, do I have the right, most importantly, do I have the right VPs in place, right? If you're C-suite, who owns sales, who owns customer success, who owns marketing, maybe more important than anything else. And if you're a VP of RevOps, you're really focused exclusively on the revenue component, like the RevOps component, and you're supporting the broader strategy, but the focus changes. It focuses from exclusively RevOps to all of revenue in general. I mean, there's 100,000 plus companies out there. I'm sure there's deviations from that, but that's how I would approach that question without knowing anything about a company.
No, that's great. So one, as you think about kind of your career, what's an area of like revenue operations that you just personally are interested in like growing professionally in?
What I'm really excited about, me personally, about RevOps, and where I want to see more of this go is owning more of the revenue outcomes, right? Not just behind the scenes. I see people say, we got a RevOps team as like a Salesforce admin. I'm like, well, technically, I guess, but that's really just a Salesforce team. Or they say we have an ops team. It's like, well, that person is just running payroll or commissioning, who then heads off the payroll. Like, but really, and that's something I've been fortunate enough to be at Hopin is really bringing in RevOps to the seat of the table to drive outcome. I alluded to it earlier, but from my perspective, what I'm excited about is the growth hacking capabilities of RevOps. And what I mean by growth hacking is it's not just about, is time to touch low, or what is time to touch, which is like baseline. If you don't know what it is, then hopefully either yourself or manager or RevOps can give that to you. But how do you actually drive time to touch down? And then what the entire sales led and product led funnel is made up of basically absolute numbers and conversion rate. So you got 1,000 leads, and what did you convert those at? And then you get 1,000 opportunities, and what did you convert those at? Right? By and large, that's generally how a pipeline looks. And so most of the team has worked on just total quantity. How many leads can we create? How many ops can we create? How many can we close? And RevOps has an opportunity through a growth hacking mindset to really think about ways to drive better conversions for that, right? And think of, and when I say growth hacking, because it's a good example is, Hotmail back in the day. There's an old example of how Hotmail scaled because they ended up putting into their signature the ability to sign up for more, right? And it was just it was a growth hack of like, you send an email and you get a new customer, send an email, get a new customer. So today that seems kind of normal, but that was kind of the introduction outside of branding, as opposed to putting billboards. You found different ways to increase results through innovative ways other than just spending money on paid ads. And so revenue operations has that capability through the entire funnel to see ways to improve outcomes through increased conversions and through other ways that you can basically hack that system, which is, I give you an example again. So I'll stick to the original top of the funnel one, which was, Chili Piper for us. It quite literally doubled our conversion rates from request to meetings. Now, most marketing teams are going to go, we generated X pipeline. They say generated 5 million pipeline. Well, that's good, but if you dial in, how did you get to that pipeline, right? And so if you said, okay, we received 1,000 requests for our support and we generated 5,000, well, did you just email them all? Well, what was your email reply rate, right? If you implement a process where you can, for us, it literally went from, if we got 100 requests, 30% of those would turn into a meeting just by emailing them. When we implemented Chili Piper, we got up to 66%, right? And so that meant that we could double the outcome of a pipeline, because we now had literally double the amount of meetings at the next stage, because we put the right tools and systems and processes in place to drive that. And that happens all the way to the point of the renewal, from onboarding to expansion opportunities, to identifying with the point where somebody is running out of products, right? If you're at 70-80% usage on data, on seats, et cetera, are you flagging upsell opportunities and giving those to your sales team in real time, right? And so those are things that are all best case scenarios, but those are ways that I think RevOps can do more than just, did you run payroll? Did you route leads, right?
Yep.
Did we flag everybody within a product that could upgrade and upsell? And how are we doing that? So like, it's just happening in real time from the customer.
Did we make our insights actionable, right? Like, that's the thing that, I think about a lot. Like, we have so much like great data and great information. Like, how do we actually make it actionable and make it scalable and impactful for the organization? One of the things that comes up a lot, and I feel, as a RevOps leader as well, is capacity. So when you think about the growth hacking and like the prioritization, like, how do you approach that, right? Knowing that sometimes you don't have enough data to really fully quantify the impact, right? That's why you've got to make hypothesis and like make bets. But like, what's your decision-making process of like where you're going to focus your time, energy, and effort?
I think a lot of it has to do with understanding baselines. Where are you supposed to be? Because if I said we convert 1/3 of our meetings to sales.
I love you for saying that. So thank you.
Baselines?
Yes, I'm so big on that. So thank you.
Yep, and it's hard because it takes experience, but two, it takes attending calls like this and asking questions. Like, I can't tell you how many people I've reached out to and be like, hey, we're working on this topic. What are you seeing? What's like, how do I get a baseline? How do I know if something's good or bad? Because if I said we convert 1/3 of our meetings to qualify, if 1/3 of our MQLs become qualified, is that good? Is that bad? One could be by industry, but let's assume that it was 33%. Do you spend all your time trying to make it better? Is it realistic that 40% is part of your max capacity, right? But let's say our time to touch was 5 days.
Yep.
Okay, what's more realistic? I'm going to increase our conversion rates from 30 to 80%, or can I get time to touch from 5 days to 5 minutes, right? And what's going to drive the biggest result? And so you're faced with quite literally 100 of those at any given moment throughout the entire revenue cycle, which is the value of RevOps versus sales ops. Sales ops is looking at sales, marketing ops is looking at marketing ops, CX is CX, and customer success. Revenue, you can look at the entire thing and put together a plan and say, here are the areas that we can drive the biggest impact. What is our upsell opportunity? What if we bundle products? What do our renewal rates look like? How do we get better at bundling products? How do we, what is our internal
daisy chain it together, right? Like it's
Correct.
an experience, right? So like, as you think about the Chili Piper booking, like what happens next? And because you can own that entire process, you can influence and drive and measure behind it.
And prioritize, right? As opposed to each ops team just kind of focusing on their vertical. With RevOps, you get the ability to look at that revenue cycle and say, we're really going to prioritize these areas. Yes, this is not good, but neither is this. And if we get this right, we've got bigger impact, right?
Yep.
And the ability to have that perspective based off of baselines, I think is what gives outshines the the siloed approach that can be the alternative, which isn't a terrible thing. Like there's plenty of companies that operate that way, but the inefficiencies of not being able to see the full picture and prioritizing that matter, I think is a key component that gives RevOps the value.
Yeah, and one of the big things like I feel like I continuously say and think about is like, you can't improve what you don't measure, right? And like you can't measure what you don't have a process for, right? So you have to have some level of like standardization to get those internal benchmarks, and that comes from process, right? And having some consistency in what you're doing to be able to build those baselines, have those like foundational metrics that then you can champion challenger against. But if everyone's off doing their own thing and it's the Wild West, right? It's going to be really hard to measure the impact and drive the impact and like actually not course correct, but innovate and improve if you don't know where you're starting.
That's right. And I think one of the areas that can be the most confusing sometimes is post-sale. Who handles, is it product support? Is it customer success? Is it account managers, an account executive, right? And so there's a lot of ways at which companies can handle post. Do you have a scaled approach? At what point do you go from self-serve to having a manage like a named CSM? And how do you think about that post-sale structure? And how do you bring in product-led growth so that we can flag opportunities for upsell opportunities? And so when things exist just between sales and CX, that world, like the customer doesn't think that way. The customer is thinking about one single experience with the company.
Yep.
And so when you can create a baseline of what those metrics look like, what needs to drive outcome, and ultimately what drives revenue, then RevOps can help prioritize based off the entire picture there.
What are some of the hottest trends that you're seeing today in RevOps?
It's a tough question. I wouldn't say I'm a guru in all things RevOps outside of my world of RevOps. I know that what I'm working on, what I'm excited about, I've tried to stay in tune to things like Red Genius and this series. I'm so excited about just even the ones I've attended, the other ones that came before it. And so I'm really listening to what other people are working on in it. And so I would say the hottest trend for me for RevOps is it feels like open territory, right? When you think about any type of profession, there's basically known knowledge and then unknown. And a lot of people spend their career just learning the known, like what is out there that I need to know to do my job successfully. And then you get to a point where like, oh, there's a whole lot of questions that haven't been answered, and people are just answering that. And that to me is the hottest trend of RevOps, is there's a lot of people trying to figure out what does this new world of SaaS look like, right? The boom of 2020, 2021, there's so many companies that raise money. There's so many software companies out there that the average company has between like 100 or 50 to 100 different software tools. And so when I was an account executive, we were still, an decent horseback company, but our lead routing was like an Excel sheet and quite literally like a stuffed animal that got passed around. And that was who was next up for leads and that feels totally different than today. And so the amount of tools that can exist, the importance of making those tools efficient, the amount of tools that are remote, there's just so many unknown questions. So for me, the hottest trend of RevOps is answering the unknown questions. And the companies that do that best, I think are going to be in a better position than the companies that don't, or don't even ask them at all.
I love that. And I think, back to your point, the known versus the unknown, like I look at, my official career in revenue operations as a term, has only been over the last 5 years or so under like an actual revenue operations function. Obviously I've sat in revenue operations as a concept or just functional operations, but there's not the playbook, right? There's not the one size fits all approach. I've reported in through IT, CEO, commercial heads, like to your point, it depends on the business, depends on the organization, all of that. There's not a right answer to anything structurally or how you're hiring. It's very much dependent on the business. And I think there's so much autonomy that comes into that as like being a member of a RevOps team and really building teams from scratch or like shaping a team around the needs of the business that you don't always see as much in other kind of key functions where it is a little bit more black and white. We have a lot more gray, which for somebody like me, I like that. That ability, right? Because we're really shaping what we see needing to be done versus like staying inside the lines.
That's right. Yeah, it's a very open industry, and there are industry norms, and there are things that people kind of aligning on that I think is helpful. But
Yep.
at the same time, like there's a lot of options for creativity, and to apply what potentially is an industry standard, even though that might be loosely determined, to what your business is and at the stage of your business. Because the startup, if it is a startup, then what you're doing now may not be relevant just 3 to 6 months from now. And so for some people that sounds terrifying. It's like you put in a plan and it's outdated 90 days to 120 days later. Maybe because you just raised around and you just quadrupled the size of the company, or at least doubled, right? And now the lead routing or the process you put in place just doesn't apply anymore. And so that to me is really exciting. But it can, for somebody who's not looking for that type of, as I call it, positive chaos, then that might be like worst case scenario for them. If they're looking for stability, I think startups is a tough place to be, but particularly RevOps, because RevOps is the engine room of a lot of GTM teams.
Yeah, I feel like we're a unique breed who enjoy this. I like the word positive chaos. That's a nice way to phrase it. Are there any specific industries that you like see who are maybe falling behind on the RevOps curve?
Yeah, I think this was, I don't know if it's, again, I'm definitely not, I'm not an expert in other industries outside the ones I work on. I have casual interest in paying attention to other ones, but I would say RevOps to me, from my perspective, the conversations I have had does require at least decision makers who are open to doing things differently, right? If you're working within an industry that's predominantly, this is what we did 5 years ago, and this is what we should do for the next 5, you're probably going to see a lot of hesitancy to adopt things like revenue operations, because again, from my perspective, it's not just IT or analytics, it really is growth hacking within the revenue cycle. And the idea of like, what is growth? Like, whatever, just give me leads and sell it. Like, if it's that mentality, you're gonna have people who are just gonna view RevOps as like just a basic call center. And I've seen people like, oh, we're not call centers. Like, you get a salary
or help desk, right? Tech support.
Yeah, which is not to say, but those teams all provide value. But what is RevOps and why do I need it? If there's hesitancy within the industry to adopt some new trends, you're probably going to see RevOps on the outside of that curve. If you're part of an industry or you're part of an environment, there's always saying, hey, look, how do we get better? What's new out there? How do we adapt? How do we remain agile? You're probably going to see RevOps being more adapted and being much more involved than just, back end ops teams.
Perfect. No, and then another question that came in was, what was your aha moment in RevOps that made you say, wow, I love this shit. RevOps is for me.
I always joke that I'm a sales guy that did one too many Salesforce reports. And before you know it, people just keep asking you to do more of those things. And so the aha moment for me was when I realized I could really drive revenue targets without being an individual contributor. And when I saw the fruits of my labor really start driving actual results, I thought, well, I could really think about this as like, I don't know, like I like board games, so like Axis and Allies and Risk for somebody, basically seeing the full picture and seeing not just what's this call, what's this meeting, but how, if you got $10 million in pipeline of 500,000, whatever, at any given stage, and you got X amount of million in renewals, or even just 5 renewals, the ability to think about it as a holistic picture and to really feel like you can drive outcomes, that for me was the like, this is awesome. You put something in place and it goes live and it works, and all of a sudden you see numbers go up. Sometimes they go down, but if you give yourself a little bit of a sprint planning, then you can adjust course. But as things do this and you make positive adjustments, like that's really exciting. And that to me is as exciting as being a VP of sales or being an account executive, being a sales manager, which is you're not just supporting a number, you're literally helping drive that number.
Yeah, I've liked, the puzzle, right? So like that came up in the Q&A. It's, for me, it was always like, okay, I've owned, the small piece of it, right? Whether that's, the marketing piece or a pipeline piece, but like being able to come in and look at like, okay, we're taking a new route to market. We're going into a new geo, we're launching a new product, like what comes into that, right? And helping really build that customer experience and that seller experience from beginning to end, and like put the plan in place and then like work the plan and improve the plan. So that's always kind of been, the part that has been really fulfilling for me is like owning the pie, not just like a slice of
That's right,
of the pie. question came in, what's the best path to move from sales leadership, where I've been handling a lot of what you've been describing, into a RevOps role?
Again, depends on the size of the company, right? If there's an existing ops team, then it's working with ops on some projects they're working on. If there's not an existing ops team, then you've got even a greater opportunity, because a lot of people don't want to do ops, right? They don't want to know how the sausage is made, right? They just want it to exist. And so I think for people who want to be in ops and there's clear intent, you've actually got a lot of opportunity, because I don't know if a lot of people want to do it, right? For better or for worse, right? It's something that it's different. Like, again, in my late 20s, I did not want to do ops. Like, I would have felt really bad if you're like, hey, you're an ops person. I'm like, damn, I already wanted to run sales. But now, in my mid 30s, I love the bigger picture spot. And so at this point in my life, it's a great opportunity. And so if you want to get involved, at a minimum, for me, when I've done interviews for RevOps roles, I personally filter for just strategy types. Because some people are like, oh, I like strategy. And it's like, well, yeah, strategy is part of it. You got to execute the strategy. You don't win.
You got to know how to build the strategy too, right?
Build it. Like, oh, you want to decrease time to touch? It's not enough to be like, let's decrease time to touch. You're like, how? And not just how, very specifically, what are you going to write into which software to make that world happen? Because somebody, like, it has to go literally all the way down. And we're not talking, there are some things that require code, but everything we do is no code. But most of it is just basic logic statements, like if this, then that. That's kind of what drives most, at least, operations tools. And so do you really want to own that full picture? Now, there are ops teams that you can specialize at different stages, and somebody is exclusively focusing on comp or compensation, or they're exclusively focused on lead routing or top of the funnel. And so you can say, I really like this area of the business, and maybe your company has that, and you can be part of that specific area and then go generalist. Or if you're a really early stage startup, maybe you can have generalists and you can do it all to begin with. But at a minimum, you got, I think, validate you want to work with the tools, because I think it's not enough just to be pure strategy. You got to say, do you want to roll your hands up and do those? You don't have to want to be an admin forever, but do you want to do that? Do you want to know how the sausage is made? Because CPQ, like, there's a whole lot that goes into making the CPQ process work. And if you just want to do deal desk and you just want to do strategy, well, how do you actually implement new SKUs, and how do you actually implement the approvals? Because the backend admin of a lot of these things aren't that fun. And so do you want to do the unfun parts to do the fun parts? Or maybe some people find that fun, but at least for me, that's that balance.
Yep. And if you don't know how to actually execute the strategy, like, how can you build it, right? So you've got to, some way, shape, or form, be able to understand. And I always think about, like, the limitations, right? So, like, understanding the limitations of the tools and, like, the purpose of the tool, right? So, like, when you think about, like, can I do this? That's a limitation or a function of the tool. And then it's, should I do it in this tool, in terms of, like, is this the right place to actually execute out of, even if I can. Had another question come in on, do you see a variable component to RevOps comp like you do in sales?
Yeah, before I answer that question, I will answer the last question more directly, which is action. When I've met, because I've had that question asked a ton, internally and externally. I want to be in RevOps. Walk me through what you're doing today that shows me that you're interested in RevOps. Do you make your own reports? Do you make your own dashboards? Like, just, if they don't do any of those things, my thought is just like, well, why not? If there's general interest, the thing about if you want to play guitar, start playing the guitar.
Yeah, have you taken trailheads? Have you started, like,
exactly.
What self-education have you done? Right? Like,
right. And if you find that interesting, keep doing that, because you will find the world will materialize around that. Because there are a lot of people, again, who don't want to do it. So you're like, yeah, I do trailheads. I'm interested in this. I want to, I understand how to influence the outcome through the systems and tools around me. Right. And I understand the people component, because I came from sales, or I came from marketing. Then you're going to find people like, great, go do it, because there are people who want that to happen in an organization. So I would say just start there. Basically, if there's a guitar, pick up a guitar and start playing it. And if you like it, keep doing it. And you're going to find people who can say, keep doing that for me. That applies to all the systems out there. So, and then to the question that was just asked, that was
the variable comp in RevOps. Like, are you seeing kind of like a variable compensation component?
It's come up a lot. I would say we don't have variable comp. Even on the deal desk component, we don't do that. I don't think it's crazy to have variable comp, but I'm a huge, I could spend the next hour talking just about comp strategy, but I'm a big believer that comp strategies needs to be aligned to action. I kind of alluded to that in something else, which is if your target is that, your comp is that, you need to have the agency, the ability to influence the outcome through your actions. And RevOps as a function supports the entire revenue cycle. But to own that number, I think is by variable comp feels that in that structure, that RevOps team would have to have a much stronger action oriented role and responsibility to that number. Now, we have a bonus structure for non-variable comps. And so my bonus, because I'm not variable comp, I have a base and a bonus. My bonus is tied to that revenue number. And so I spent 10 years on variable comp. I spent 100% variable and then like 50% variable and like 40% as I did different roles. But like it was absolutely the weirdest thing when I just got a base salary. I was like, I just get paid to like do work. Like it's that transition. So I 100% understand variable. But I would say for me, that bonus still kind of meets that need, which is a part of my salary, part of my compensation is tied to the revenue number of the company. When we set this number for the company, I have a financial incentive for that number to exist. And I feel like that feels variable to me.
Yeah, same. I mean, right? Like I've got a focus and like that's, obviously it's not variable in terms of like a quota carrying, but it is variable in terms of like a goal that we all win when we hit, and working on like that focus of like, this is, ultimately where we're trying to achieve, and what I'm focused on should be aiming to improve that.
That's right. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, I know
incentive outside of variable, basically.
I know we've got just 2 minutes left, and I'm sure everyone, lives in a Zoom hopping world, but anything else you'd like to close with? I really appreciate your time today, and this has been a great session.
I would close with join RevGenius, join communities, because I think that's when we think about RevOps, there just simply isn't there's not an academy. I mean, there are some like HubSpot and some in SaaStr, and there are a lot of groups that are putting out some content that's really good out for RevOps. But these are the type of things that I personally come to learn and listen from. And people say, "What do you learn about RevOps?" I'm like, I've been to some of your content. I've seen people post stuff, and I've reached out to them on Slack and LinkedIn and say, "Hey, can I pick your brain? How are you doing PLG for this?" And so. And how you shift, or I saw this new product launch where I'm thinking about a comp plan for a CSMs. I really want to drive this business outcome, but I'm weighing decisions between this and that. And I would say be involved in the community, reach out to people, because you're just going to find that the questions you're asking, they're asking, and it goes back to baselines. Like I benefit the more I talk to more people, because I've got more of an understanding of what should be or shouldn't be and where to prioritize. And so that's my plug: is join groups, join communities, and come to these things.
And ask the questions, right? There's no stupid question. Like, feel free to reach out. I mean, I'm on the Slack communities. I know you are. Like, ask the questions. I think most of us are more than willing to help. And like, if we can prevent somebody from making a similar mistake that we've made, like, I'm happy to share. And if I can, tout a success I've seen, I want to share that too. And like, on the flip side, I also want to learn. Because that to me is like the great part about these conversations, is like, I'm always interested what other people are doing and what I can learn from them. So really appreciate your time today. This has been phenomenal. Audience engagement, great questions, and have a great, I about said Wednesday, but it's actually Thursday. So awesome. Thanks so much.
Likewise. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.